Working It Out, a podcast show about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workplaces, our communities, and our lives. A show where we put diversity and inclusion to work.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out. Dr. V.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, your host of Working It Out. And on today's episode, we have Dr. J. Bruce Stewart. He is a renowned DE&I academic and practitioner. Bruce is really a thought leader, and many of the diversity theories and practices he's introduced the world to have been game changers. For example, not only is he a renowned academic as a professor at American University, but he has worked for some of the most complex organizations. For example, he retired, he doesn't look like it, but he retired lieutenant colonel from the US Air Force as an engineer. He worked for the federal government, and under the Obama administration, he was the associate director in the Office of Workforce Diversity, and they revamped the whole federal system in regards to how the federal government leveraged diversity, equity, and inclusion to really improve the performance of our federal agencies. And now Bruce is CEO of Small World Solutions, and we are fortunate to have him as our Chief Content Officer at Alignment Strategies. So I just want to say welcome, Bruce.
Well, Dr. Weaver, thank you so much for that wonderful, even though I don't necessarily know if I deserve it, introduction, but I'm just, anytime I get a chance to chat with you about DE&I and the things that we're trying to do, together, it's just, it just makes for a great day for me. So happy to be here.
Well, I guess we're each other's cheerleaders. So thank you again for being here. Well, Bruce, I am so excited that you have published your book, which is titled.
It's called The Click Code: Why Some Teams Click and Others Don't. And very excited to have it, published hardback right now, but coming out in the Kindle version on Christmas Day.
On Christmas Day, and you had a beautiful Christmas tree behind you. So Bruce, why did you write this particular book? Of all the topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you have been a game changer, why did you decide to write The Click Code?
So that's a great question, Vanessa. The first thing is that I've always had a fascination with teams and why some teams worked and some teams didn't, even with regard to my experiences in the military, and then as the Deputy Director for Diversity and Inclusion for the federal government during the Obama administration. It just seemed that, if you got on a good team, it was just almost like magic. And then on the other hand, most of the work that was happening in the federal government is moving away from individuals or centered around individuals to more around teams and more diverse teams. And what I was saying is that a lot of these diverse teams, leaders and managers, didn't really have the necessary tools, or were equipped with the necessary tools to be able to manage and lead in an inclusive way these more and more diverse teams that they're responsible for. So the Click Code is really my view on how you can marry these two things together to create teams that are productive, high performing, and lack of a better word, teams that click.
You make an interesting point, because for many people, when they think of diversity and equity and inclusion, they think we have enough people that have different ethnicities and races, gender, sexual orientation, that's all you need to make diversity work. But our experience in your firm and also in Alignment Strategies has shown us that just having diverse people who have physical characteristics of diversity isn't really sufficient. What's the secret sauce?
That's again, that's another great question. So the secret sauce, just let me cut to the chase. The secret sauce is inclusion as a strategy to create what is known as social capital. And social capital are the connections and trust that team players establish between themselves once a social connection and the sharing of personal information is made. And what it does is it creates and promotes trust. And so the way we look at it is that we use inclusion as kind of the glue and a tactic and strategy to harness the inherent diversity that are made up of teams, and then using that to increase social capital.
So is another way to think about social capital is to think about it as in effective relationships?
Absolutely. And in a nutshell, that's what we mean by social capital. You know, Robert Putnam is a university professor that wrote a transformative book about 20 years ago called Bowling Alone. And in that book, he talked about, you know, the fact that there were less and less bowling leagues. In other words, there were fewer and fewer opportunities for people to come together across lines of race, ethnicity, class, and religion. And bowling alleys were one of those places that no matter what background you had, you could come together and meet folks that are different around a game, you know, in these bowling leagues. But as these bowling leagues started to decline, he also found so did our rates of community activism and our levels of social capital, which, you know, if you look at it today, can kind of be an explanation of why there's been such a decay of trust and polarization in our current society.
Well, I find it fascinating because a lot of times when people think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they think of it as being some big mystical, complicated, elaborate process. But what you and I have found in our work, particularly mine at Alignment Strategies and yours at Small World Solutions, is that if you can create that social capital through effective relationships, then you become ahead of the game. And we know through our work that many times multicultural individuals, particularly multicultural women, have challenges forming those kind of robust relationships, i.e. developing that social capital that allows for them to navigate effectively in organizations. And so focusing on the relationship is key. Focusing on developing that social capital, as you discuss it, is really key. So what makes it difficult to form social capital?
So the challenge, and there's several challenges, but there's a few that are kind of head and shoulders above the rest. So one of them is just proximity, right? What we know through social science is that when you're closer to a person, you know, physically, it makes it much easier to develop a relationship. I don't know if you have, or any of the listeners out there have worked with somebody over the years and your cubicles are right next to each other, or your offices were close and you always went out to lunch and that type of thing. But that person got a new job and moved to not even to a different building, but just moved to, you know, another floor or down the hallway, and it's like you never see him again. So proximity, we know, is one challenge to social capital. The other challenge, and this is where I have really spent a lot of time with social network science, is being able to identify folks who are outside of their social network, kind of on the outside looking in. So some people, regardless of their race or gender or sexual orientation, are not as embedded or connected as others. And what we found is that the type of connections that you have and the amount of connections that you have within your social network is probably the greatest predictor of whether you're able to achieve your potential within your organization.
What's interesting, as I think about this proximity challenge that you talk about in terms of social capital, we've been dealing with this COVID situation now for almost 2 years. And it looks like we're entering into another phase of more virtual work at home, closing down offices and being more restrictive. So how has that impacted the cultivation of social capital in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space?
Yeah, so it makes it certainly more of a challenge, but we shouldn't look at this as something that's completely, out of the ordinary. I mean, multinational companies, which you've worked with, and myself, they've been doing this forever, with different folks working on a team in different time zones, different countries, and that type of thing. What we know, though, for American companies, if you want to maintain those levels of social capital, you probably, and you're working in this COVID environment where everybody's working from home, you probably need to triple the number of contacts that you have on a personal basis with the employees that you work with. And that gives you the opportunity to kind of make up lost ground. So that doesn't mean that you create wholly new, Zoom
call.
But what you do is those regular staff meetings that you have, instead of getting right to work, maybe you take the first 10 minutes and you talk about our prompt conversations around personal things, or play a game, or do an exercise that can create the building blocks to maintain those social relationships that have become more difficult to maintain since we went to this kind of COVID organization.
Well, Bruce, just building on that, in your book, in the Click Code, Why Some Teams Succeed and Others Fail, which I was fascinated reading that book, particularly the piece you had about Rosa Parks was a bad woman.
Watch your mouth.
Was a bad woman. You talked about this whole importance of understanding cognitive diversity. So when I think about where's the puck going in diversity, equity, inclusion, this whole notion of social capital and the role that cognitive diversity plays in it. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I think it's so important because, again, when we think about diversity, we're thinking about race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, those physical aspects of diversity, whether we're recruiting people or retaining people, and that's important. But talk a little bit about this element of cognitive diversity, because I was fascinated by the implications of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a good friend of mine, Scott Page, who's a mathematical economist at the University of Michigan, has done a lot of work around cognitive diversity and what he calls a diversity bonus. His first book was I shouldn't say his first book, but a book on diversity that he wrote a few years ago. It's called The Difference, and where he talked about his research. And the second book that came out last year was the diversity bonus. And basically, arguing the case that when you have a diverse team, if managed in an inclusive way, there's a bonus that you get from having those diverse people on your team. And not only in terms of identity diversity, which we commonly understand as the package that you come in, the surface differences that we have. Mm-hmm. Instead, in the diversity bonus, Scott talks about cognitive diversity. And for the viewers out there and the listeners, when we talk about cognitive diversity, it's not, this old axiom of diversity of thought. I mean, that's what people say who don't really understand. It's much more than that. There's, Scott was able to identify, and we all have different kind of frameworks for this, but his framework I thought was interesting. So there's a way that we see the world, which is one aspect of cognitive diversity, the paradigm. The second is, what he would call rules of thumb. There's certain ways that we go about doing our business based on how we were educated and where we grew up and things like that. And then the third is categorization. How do we sort or categorize the world around us? Depending on what society you grow up in, eating beef might not be the thing to do. And so That's what we mean by cognitive diversity. But I want to even take it a step further. And in the book, I talk about it not in terms of cognitive diversity so much, but the more important aspect of that is what I call psychological roles. And you need to understand that teams that are successful have a diversity of psychological roles that people incorporate on the team that helps the team increase productivity and performance.
So psychological role would be what? I mean, give me an example.
Based on network science, what we've been able to identify is that there's primarily, some researchers say 3, 4, some say 5, but right now I say 3. But what I call them is that on all teams that are successful that we found based on the research, one of the psychological roles that they have is what we call the informal captain. And the informal captain is somebody that might not have positional authority, but they have informal influence. And people seem to come to them with whatever problems. And there's a lot of great research from sports that talks about, team captains and how they have the informal influence and trust of the rest of their teammates to really be able to make a positive impact on the team. The second type is what we call charismatic connectors. And this was identified by Alex Pentland, who was an MIT professor that runs their MIT Media Lab. He wrote a book called Social Physics that came out in 2014. And his team created these sociometers, these little badges that track all the nonverbal data that goes on between two people talking or a group interacting. And based on that, what Pentland and his team found is that there's a certain type of person that brings everybody together. In other words, they, it's the kind of person that you walk down the hall with and they know somebody in finance, somebody in maintenance, somebody, they're called charismatic connectors, and it's the power of their charisma that is able to draw people to them. And then the third psychological role that we found that was important to team productivity and performance was what we call team players, right? And a team player is the person that, like, if you're in the office, they're the person that's high in collaboration. They're always looking to collaborate. So if you need something set up in the break room for somebody's birthday or promotion, that's the person that you go to. If there's somebody that needs to get a gift or creating some function, the Christmas party, whatever, that's the person that you go to. It's the glue that holds the team together. And we all have these type of people within our families. And once, they might pass on, like my brother and my mother, who have both since passed, they were the glue, that kind of team player that held the family together. And I've noticed a considerable difference in the amount of communication that our family has since those two have not been in our family of network relationships. So those are the three types of psychological roles that, when we talk about diversity, these are what really adds value to teams in terms of psychological diversity.
Well, I know in some of the work that we've done in the utility sector in particular, that we've actually gone into teams and had people identify within teams who in their team plays those roles. And then to have some kind of discussion or exploration and then discussion around how are they fully leveraging those particular roles on their teams. And in your book, The Click Coach, you talk about how important it is to know who's playing what roles in the team. And then you also talked about, which I was fascinated with because we've talked about it so much, for years, is the importance of feedback. Yeah. And you talk about feedback not only in terms of its affirming quality, but the fact that it builds trust and enhances camaraderie when people use the feedback as a way of critiquing what didn't go so well in a team or in a process or among team members, as a way of really looking at how the team can then look at that and enhance their overall performance. Yeah. And you talk about how important it is that trust is built in the team so that they can, in fact, feel free to share that feedback and know that people will take it as intended.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's so fascinating about this whole concept of feedback is that in the book, I talk about it in terms of plussing up and plussing down. And basically this technique of plussing, in other words, of being able to build upon a person's idea rather than tear it down, was kind of initiated and created by Walt Disney. If you remember, Walt Disney is the kind of thinking that he used to create the Disney theme parks. The idea there was to give more than what anybody asked for. And then that concept was taken by the folks who started Pixar, the movie studio in the world for a long time. And the folks who run that studio, basically, they give all the love for their success to this technique that Walt Disney started called plussing, and that no idea is a bad idea. The one thing that they say is that you don't tear down an idea, but you build upon it in a constructive way. So they've used this technique, with all their successful movies, and it's just fascinating. And I sincerely believe it's something that we can apply, as a tactic into the benefit or for the benefit of good teamwork.
And so if you think about plussing as a way to build effective teams, right, and increase productivity, what are the other success factors of a team? If you could tell us what the top three, plussing is one, what would you say are the other top two?
Making sure to identify what I call the it factors. In other words, we just talked about it, the psychological roles that the different folks on your team plays. And then the other thing that I hadn't talked about was something I call the inclusion rule. So basically there's three elements that we found that turns teamwork from, kind of magic to understanding the code, or what I call learning the code. And to learn the code, you need to do these three things. You need to create a team identity that's called the inclusion rule, or what I would call the Three Musketeers mindset, right? The Musketeers mindset, all for one and one for all. It's that kind of thinking when everybody plays for each other instead of playing for themselves, that we found to be a critical aspect or ingredient for team success. The second, as I talked about, was the it factors, making sure that people identify and what psychological roles they're playing on the team. And then the third is what I call the plus principle, which is what we just talked about, this whole tactic and strategy of plussing up rather than plussing down. And then finally, I'll just say, when you have those three things, you have to apply them, and what I call plus points are moments that matter. And within every team and every organization, there are 4 moments that matter that can help, spread, these traits and values exponentially. The first is how you communicate. So if you communicate in an inclusive way, then you have a chance your team has a chance to be successful. The second is resolving conflict. And so you want to use these principles to be able to resolve conflict. The third is adapting to change. And the fourth is problem solving or promoting creativity. And when you apply what we've been talking about in this interview to those 4 areas, those 4 moments that matter, then you can take your team from one that underperforms to a team that performs and gives more than what it started out expecting.
Well, I'm just dying to ask you this question, and that is, clearly the success factors or the key elements for a team make all the sense in the world. My question is, what does that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Isn't that a separate genre, like effective teams, and then you have diversity, equity, and inclusion over here?
Yeah.
How do you? It seems like you're connecting the two.
Yeah, and the reason, Dr. Weaver, is because it's long overdue. The fact of the matter is, a big challenge and half the problem for us in this area is that we've always disconnected, DE&I from leadership, team building, teamwork, successful teams. And what I'm saying is that should be no separation. That if you want effective teams, then you have to embed DE&I principles into it. And just to take it on to a further level, when I do work in organizations, every organization has a D&I council that's responsible for executing their diversity, inclusion, and equity strategic plan, or they have an office. And one of the things, I hate to say it, but one of the things that I found that's almost pretty consistent is that the folks who are most responsible for the DE&I strategies are the folks or the teams that get along the worst. And then, which adds on to one of the reasons that a lot of us don't think as much progress has been made as possible, is because the folks who are responsible for it don't know how to create teams that click. In other words, they think it's this kind of magic when in fact it's the code.
That's fascinating, because you and I have talked a lot about, working in organizations, and some of our greatest challenges come from the diversity teams that are tasked with implementing a diversity initiative. And so the challenge around how do they make diverse teams click might in fact be where we start with our consulting with them, in terms of, how do we going to make this, we consult you internal D&I? How do you make those two come together? So
Well,
that's really fascinating.
Vanessa, that, a big challenge that we've had before is, the kind of this Hatfields and McCoy type of conflict between EEO professionals and diversity and inclusion professionals.
Yes.
And which is embedded in which, and who should get the budget. And, so it's just a challenge. And I think, the Clear Code, or thinking like this, is one of the ways that we can satisfy that, along with this concept on social capital. We have human capital, we have intellectual capital, we have financial capital. Now, D&I folks and EO folks need to come together and understand that social capital, there's an investment in relationships around teamwork that should be our responsibility.
Well, maybe we need to have a separate show where we talk about that dynamic, because it's a fascinating one. Well, I know our time is closing, and I would love for you to share with our audience. Say we have a company and they're saying, we want to do D&I, but we want to broaden it. We really want to talk about and look at how can DE&I be an enabler to our team's success. So what would you share as the top 3 recommendations you would tell a company to consider?
Well, the first is that this problem around representation, inclusion, equity, overcoming systemic racism, these problems are solvable. In other words, sometimes it comes across to some individuals like battling climate change.
Yeah.
Global warming is coming, but you're wondering if the little things you do can make a difference. And what I'm here to say is that based on the evidence and the research, you can make a difference. It doesn't take everybody on board to change a culture. It only takes 3% of what we call game changers or advocates that are really hyped up. In other words, this is coming close to Christmas, so you think about Jesus and his apostles. If you got 3% of your folks that you can turn into apostles or advocates, that's the first step that you can use. The second that we found out through research from a professor by the name of Damon Santola is that it doesn't take 51% to change or flip or tip an organization's culture. It only takes 25%, whether you're talking about Black Lives Matter movement or whether you're talking about some of the other movements that have went on around the world. It only takes 25%. So the idea is those 3%, right, of change advocates go out and they impact their particular personal social networks of about 150 people. And that gets us to the 25%, which will get us to be able to flip the organization. And really, we'll start to see some real change in the composition of, leaders within teams as well as organizations. But they need to start thinking in terms of networks and relationships instead of always thinking that they have to have leadership, buy-in, number one. There are a lot of folks within your organization that has informal influence, and those are the folks that you need.
Well, Dr. Stewart, I really appreciate those 3 tips and the 3 insights and just all that you shared with us around small world networks and cognitive diversity and just kind of where the puck is going in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So on behalf of my team and our listeners, I'm going to thank you for being a part of our show today. And I personally and feel so blessed to have you here. So thank you so very much. And you shared a lot of insights, again, many of which I want to adopt and we'll be adopting in our ongoing work together. So again, thank you, our viewers and listeners, for tuning in to the show. And on behalf of our team and Dr. Stewart, I wish you a safe, productive, and be happy week. Goodbye.
Working It Out is brought to you by Alignment Strategies, a management consultancy with more than 3 decades of experience in diversity, equity and inclusion, and organizational development. To learn more, visit alignmentstrategies.com.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it